there's team building happening on this webinar. I love it. Okay, so a little bit of a definition. Thank you for those answers, and we'll do another one of these in a little while regarding another topic. So the dictionary actually says that team building is the action or process of causing a group of people to work together effectively as a team, especially by means of activities and events designed to increase motivation and promote cooperation. So, of course, I'm not going to disagree with that definition. I think it's a great definition of team building. It's the one from dictionary. The things that I want to focus on are motivation and cooperation, right? Because what we see it as, and what we hear from our clients, is that, yes, activities and events that bring people together are absolutely valid, and they are a wonderful way to make connections with one another and to know each other better. But how do you keep that experience going over time, right? So, and in our experience, these experiences can often be fleeting if they're not followed up with long-term practices to implement. And so that's where we come in, is really with those practices, because we have a method of listening and storytelling that we can put in place to actually create better team effectiveness. So that's sort of taking it a little bit one step further from team building, and we talk about collaboration, right? And where does collaboration come from? Good collaboration comes from communication that is not necessarily perfect. Our goal is not perfection here. Our goal is always connection, right? So we're looking at communication as a way of connecting people. And we feel like the best way to connect people is through storytelling. So what happens when there's a disconnect? Well, what happens when there's a disconnect is that it disrupts our way of collaborating with one another. And there are two disconnects that can happen. The first one is between team members, right? And what happens is that perhaps you've had this experience. I'm not sure. I know a lot of you are in small businesses, some in much bigger organizations. But wherever you are, the moment you have more than one person, more than 2, 3 people, you start to see people naturally gravitating towards each other because of background, because of language, perhaps if you're in a global organization, also because of what they do, right? And these roles get kind of set in stone, and that's what you do, and you don't do anything else, and you start to gravitate towards other people. And what does that do concretely? It creates this word that we know, silos. It creates silos, right? And it also can create a sense of isolation between team members, so that the marketing team doesn't really know what the accounting team is up to. Are they really useful? Are they really helpful? Have you ever had that experience where you're wondering about a colleague and you're sort of thinking, well, what exactly do they do? And I feel like I'm working a lot harder than them. And so these resentments kind of start to bubble up to the surface, and you start to wonder, many questions come up that can actually disrupt. And that's where the disconnect happens between team members, that sense of isolation. Now, that sense of isolation can also happen between leaders and their teams, right? So a leader who perhaps has founded a team, has founded an organization, can feel a kind of a loneliness because they've started it, they have the story, so to speak, and now they've grown. And how do they then share their knowledge with their team in a way that kind of levels the playing field and sort of aligns everybody towards the same goals? So that disconnect can happen in leadership as well, between leaders and their team. So we feel like stories is the best way to address any kind of disconnect, because stories naturally connect us. And you can see this picture here of a brain, and there is a function of the brain that specifically responds to storytelling. And we know this because of neuroscience. And neuroscience shows us that story is a function of the brain by having done tests that sort of show what happens to the brain when you're listening to a story and what happens to the brain when you tell a story. And the same areas of the brain light up, right? And it's that thing that, in layman terms, it makes you want to know what happens next. When you're in story mode, you just want to know what happens next, right? So what happened next? What happened to this person? And what happened to that person? And what's going to happen to you? How is it going to end, right? So we know, our brain knows naturally when the story is being told, and it absolutely wants to fill in the blanks. It wants to know what happens next. So we're hardwired for stories, is what we say at Narrative. And because of that basic principle that we hold to be true, you can rest assured that storytelling will work when you use it, because your audience will not be able to help themselves, no matter how cynical they are. They will want to know what happens next, right? So stories connect us. So I want to ask a very quick question here. We've gone through sort of, why we feel, what types of disconnects there are or can be in team collaboration. And I'm really curious as to what kinds of disconnects you might have found in your own experience. And we also call them team-related challenges here on this slide. But it's really going back to that idea of a disconnect, right? Have you ever experienced that kind of disconnect? And what actually was the challenge that occurred that you feel created a disconnect? So I'm gonna keep going, and I'll do the same thing where we'll talk a little bit about those challenges that you found. Oh, and I want to just address one thing also. Nancy and Gail, we can absolutely put you in touch with one another because we have emails that you registered with. If for some reason your email is not there, just send me an email. It's Jerome, Jerome, @narrative, narrativ.com. So whoever you want to be connected with, just let me know and we'll make that happen. So Jerome @narrativ, narrativ.com. Great, love to see that happening. So think about those team-related challenges that you've had, and please share that in the chat box as well. So I'm just going to read one right now, since we've got one that just came in. I felt disconnected from my team when we're not on the same page, right? So I could imagine that you as an individual, you may have a certain idea of where you're going, and then your team has another idea. And you know, a team is made of people. So I imagine that each individual has their own kind of background, right? And they have their own way of addressing something. So what happens when there's a disconnect there? That's a really good one. How do you bring them back to the same page? Long simmering resentments allowed to fester and hamper working together. Yep, that's something that happens a lot. And actually, one of the case study that I'm going to talk about momentarily sort of looks at those things. It's not necessarily resentments, but it's differences between people, where they come from, what their background is, how they approach a particular problem or challenge, and how they come up with these solutions, right? Agreement on goals, how do you negotiate those? The lack of direction, game plan by the team leader. So as you answer these, this is really great because I feel like you're sort of creating a library of things to address, right? Through storytelling, which is what we're talking about today. So it's really important first to actually know why do you want to use storytelling? Like, what is the problem that you want to address? As opposed to just saying, hey, storytelling is a great way to communicate. That's not enough as far as we're concerned. And that's not really what we're interested in. We're not interested in creating amazing storytellers that can tell a great tale. No, we wanted to actually solve a problem, right? So think about that problem that you're wanting to solve and then see how storytelling can improve it. So here are some ways that storytelling improves communication. The first two I lumped together, empathy and emotional connection, right? So remember, if you go back to my own story that I told you in kind of a cursory way, right? I gave you a few details of my experience and how I got to narrative. Now, there's a lot more I could say, right? But I wanted to keep it down to a couple of minutes. And I also wanted it to lead to what narrative is today and how it sort of evolved, right? And what it does specifically and how it relates to team building. So that's what I had in my mind. But what I really wanted to do was to create a connection with you guys. And perhaps something happened for you when you heard that story, when you listened to it. Maybe a little bit of empathy happened. Who knows what exactly happened to you? I'm not going to pretend to know. But in general, what does happen pretty consistently across the board, no matter where you're from, empathy does happen, right? Because it's very difficult not to empathize with someone's circumstances, especially these kind of big themes that I talked about in my own story, moving from one place to another, quitting a job, starting another one, trying to find your way into the world. And especially that sort of turning point where you're not sure that what you've set out to do is actually going to work. That's very compelling in a story. And that's what makes us empathize most, because it's a little bit vulnerable. And the storyteller is willing to do that. You're willing to show some vulnerability. That's really important in building a team, because if you're not willing to show a little bit of that vulnerability, a little bit of those moments where you weren't quite sure how things were going to turn out, but then you found a way to get to that solution that you wanted, it's the finding the way to that solution and those little bumpy moments that we're actually most interested in. Why? Because they connect us to one another. We've all had those moments in our lives. It makes you human, which is the next point, right? Humanizing each person. It's so important in a team. You know, someone said, you know, we're not aligned on our goals, where there's some resentments. When I go into the team, I say something and I feel like people are kind of separate and they're not telling me exactly what they where they're coming from, or perhaps they have a totally different way of looking at it. Well, see how knowing about that person's personal story may actually change that, and how you may be able to actually direct them in such a way that they become human to you. They're not just a label, they're not just a title. And that's really important, because that's going to help you work through those conflicts, right? So you're giving people a certain set of principles, and that's what we do to improve communication through storytelling. We don't just tell people to tell me a story. We actually tell them to tell us a story in a certain way. And the way that we ask them to tell us a story is by telling us what happened to them, and to steer clear from opinions, interpretations, what they felt about what happened, what they thought about what happened, why they were upset about what happened, why they were unhappy at someone else about what happened. No, none of that. Just tell me what happened. And if you give people the opportunity to say what happened to them, and then give the next person the opportunity to say what happened to them, then you will find commonalities, right? Because you're not so much in opinion land anymore. I could have told you I wasn't passionate about my job. It really didn't interest me at all. I wanted to do something else. I wasn't quite sure what it was going to be. I was creative. I wanted to do something artistic. That's not a story. That's just a bunch of things that are happening in my head and that no one else would be able to kind of see. Some of you might relate to it because maybe you're in a similar circumstance. But most of you, a lot of you will just say, okay, that's your life, or that's your opinion, or that's your interpretation of things. But actually, when I tell you what happened, I tell you that I walked from my desk to my boss's office and I told him I quit. Very different, right? You can see the difference, you can feel the difference. So just tell what happened. Very important part of our methodology. And what that does then is that you start to uncover hidden narratives. Two kinds of hidden narratives. One that could be disruptive to the team. And so that helps you to actually see what's going on in the team. What is the cause of those resentments? Somebody talked about resentment. Those hidden narratives can help you actually see how they're disruptive to the team. And then the positive thing that it does too is that you uncover the voices that were previously unheard. And thanks to that, innovation comes along, right? So that's really a really important part of storytelling is just being able to uncover things, right? So you can see how our approach of storytelling goes way beyond presentational or way beyond just messaging, and spinning a good tale. It's really about uncovering things, and it's about uncovering them for a specific purpose. And the purpose here is to collaborate better, to humanize people, to trust one another in a more genuine way, and to be able to work with one another that actually in such a way that connects to one another but sparks innovation, right? So where do we start when we talk about team building? Well, we start with listening. Now, listening is a really important component. It's the first component of storytelling, actually. You can't have any story without listening. And we use the analogy of this cup that you have on your screen here, where the listening is like a bowl, and the telling is like the liquid that gets poured into that bowl. So just like the bowl, the liquid takes the shape of the bowl that it's poured into, the telling takes the shape of listening that got created, right? So that's why we really need to pay attention to listening, and that everything begins with listening. You got to make sure that you have an optimal listening environment that's as clear as possible for people to tell stories and feel comfortable telling stories. And further, we say that there's a reciprocal relationship between listening and telling. So you see that loop that's going around in that image here. If there are obstacles, if there are things that are getting in the way of collaboration in the team, that loop is just not going to happen, right? So the listening is going to shape the telling in a kind of a negative way, and the telling is going to shape the listening in a negative way as well. But if you manage to actually clear that loop of obstacles, something new is going to come up. Something innovative is going to come up. And voices that you haven't heard before are going to come up. And that's all going to contribute to team effectiveness. So I'm going to go really quickly because, look at me, I've talked a lot. I'm going to go really quickly through our case study just to give you a little bit of a sense of how we work with people and how, in a concrete way, these things get played out. So the first thing we do whenever we work with anyone is we ask the question, why story, why now? So why are you telling a story? And it's kind of like you now have a list of challenges, right, that you all came up with. I encourage you to actually look at that list of challenges, and we're going to share this all with you, and we can share this list with you guys so that you have it. And you can kind of use that as inspiration, say, well, why do I want to tell a story? Why do I want to use storytelling for my team? What am I trying to address here? And is storytelling actually appropriate, right? I've kind of made a case for it, but there are some times maybe where storytelling is not the best way to communicate. And maybe that's not the way you want to communicate here, right? And then you have to ask yourself, why now, right? So why am I using a story and why in this particular moment? So for this client, it was to improve collaboration and better serve their business as a whole. They were a legal team, and this legal team was seen as very transactional. And so as a result, they were not really reaching the hearts of the businesses that they were working with, even though they were all working together. This is one big global brand that works all over the world, and there are many businesses that the legal team serves. And the businesses were kind of complaining about them as seeing them as, well, all they do is tell us what not to do. And so we don't feel like we're on the same team. So the leader of that legal team was really interested in looking at that and addressing that barrier so that they could actually be more connected to the teams. And her belief, to her credit, was that the way to connect with anyone is through the heart. And so how do you connect with someone through the heart? Well, storytelling, right? So that was why story. And that was why for that particular team and why at that particular moment. Because they needed to improve collaboration and they needed to be seen by the businesses as partners. And they needed to prove to the businesses that they could be real partners and not just transactionals telling them what not to do. So some of the challenges there. First of all, they were from all over the world. What's in red is where this team was from, about 60 people from all these different countries. And so what was happening is that there were different communication styles. There were cultural gaps. Those silos that I was talking about earlier were happening there, right? And so they weren't really connecting with one another even as team members. So they had a sort of a double communication challenge, which was connecting with each other as team members and then connecting with the larger teams that they actually served. So breaking through those silos, how did you do that? So how did we bridge those gaps to better collaboration? Well, we brought them all together. That was the first thing. We brought them all together in a beautiful space that was not their office. So it wasn't business as usual. And that's really important that I say this because storytelling is not business as usual. And you do need to think about the space in which you tell stories and the time that you use to tell stories. Time and space are very, very important in our methodology. And so we looked at, so what is it exactly that we're addressing here? We're addressing perception, right? We don't want you to be seen as transactional. We want you to be seen as a partner, not an adversary. And we also wanted to move this group from being a very cerebral group, very intellectual, to a heartfelt group, so one that knew how to reach the heart as well as the mind. And that's when we really put in place this idea and follow this principle that listening begins with you and that it begins with the heart, right? So what did we do? We brought all these people together and we started by identifying what were the obstacles to listening in this team and how could we release them. And one of the big three, I'll put them up right now: fear of looking bad in front of others, fear of public speaking, preconceptions and stereotypes. I'll give you just a very quick example, and this is going to be kind of the hero of our story. There's always needs to be a hero, right, in this, or heroine in the story. And in this case, after the first half day of the training, where we presented our methodology and what we were going to do, and we gave them a small exercise in listening, and we sort of looked at these obstacles to listening. These obstacles came up, and for someone, that fear of public speaking and looking bad and the preconceptions and stereotypes was really blocking him. He was from Japan, and we had been told that the Japanese team, from the leader of this team, that public speaking culturally was not something that they really did, and that they weren't really connecting with this sort of, I'm doing air quotes here, American way of speaking, where we're constantly putting ourselves in front of others and we're happy to do it. And again, big stereotype, right? So that's the stereotype that he's got at play. Even his leader has that stereotype about Japanese people. So you can imagine that with that stereotype in mind, how do you actually cross that barrier? No wonder he felt a little stifled, right? And so he comes up to me and he says, I'm absolutely terrified about what we're going to do next because I cannot speak in public. It's not what we do. And I'm afraid of looking bad. And I said, listen, we're going to do a few exercises. Someone talked about icebreakers. Our training is a series of icebreakers, so much so that actually, it's kind of a warm feeling by the end of it. There's no more ice at all. And really it's about making people feel comfortable in their environment and able to tell a story. And so we did those exercises with them. And by the end of that day, Here's the story that Ken told, and I'm going to tell it to you now. This is why you're hearing a rustling of papers, because I want to do it justice. And here's what Ken said with this entire group. So bear that in mind, right? There's 55 people in front of him. We did a series of small breakout groups first, where we workshopped these different stories and we found which story to tell. And we wanted people to connect on a human level and a heart level, right? Remember that that was the purpose of this. That was our why story, why now. So here's the story that Ken came up with. And at the end, he volunteered to tell this story in front of everybody else, to our great surprise. And he said, I met my wife through a colleague and proposed to her on our first date. She told me I was forward and presumptuous. You don't even know my last name, she said. We married a year later and stayed married for a year. We argued about my smoking, her cleanliness obsession, my bachelor lifestyle, and her homebody nature. We were both heartbroken, but we didn't see how we could stay together. We divorced. 3 years later, I asked her on a date again. I proposed a second time, and she said yes. We are very much in love. Now I wear 2 rings to signify the 2 marriages. They're heavy, but I appreciate the weight, right? And here's a hand with 2 rings on it. So you might be asking yourselves, well, what's this got to do with team building? Like, how does that actually connect with everything else? Well, it connects because of that idea of empathy that we talked about. It connects because of the idea of connection, right? So the result of telling that story on everybody else in the team, you should have seen it. Everybody congregated. First of all, there was a standing ovation for his story. And then everybody congregated around Ken. And a lot of people came up to me and actually said, you know, I'm in Hong Kong. I'm in the team in Hong Kong. He's in the team in Japan, and we often have to do presentations together. And he kind of sits in the corner, and I've written him off. I just know that I'm going to have to do this on my own. Now I know that he's part of my team too, and he can actually contribute in such a way that is heartfelt. And that if I need something, you know, if I need to work with him, I know I can trust him on that. And of course, Ken, what he told us as a result of this is that he felt much more comfortable with this particular team. Now, it doesn't mean that he became a public speaker, that he suddenly became an extrovert, right? It's not about that. It's about celebrating the fact that he is an introvert, that he has this personality, and that he was able to communicate to the rest of his team who he was through this very heartfelt story, right? And so it's just giving you the sense that you can tell a personal story and then connect it to that business need and those business purposes. So how do we implement these key principles here, right? So what we look at that and what we sort of extrapolate from this and what they've done, this luxury brand did, is they looked at the individual and how the individual impacts the collective. So it's really important to look at your team and say, it starts with me, right? And as I say, it starts with me, I'm also creating a wide listening net to support the storytelling process. So I am in charge of listening. I'm in control of that. I can shape listening, right? So when you are aware of that very fact, that you are responsible for listening to others and for shaping how they're going to speak to you, then if everyone's on the same page with that, and this is why we work with groups, because everybody needs to be aligned on these principles, that it starts with you, that it's going to impact the collective, and that you need to be responsible for your listening, then the storytelling process can begin. And then really, really important is to not do what that particular leader, I love her, she's great, she's a visionary, and she was able to tell us that she needed to reach the hearts, but she did have a predetermined way of looking at certain members of her team, right? She told us, oh, the Japanese just write them off, they're probably not going to participate, it's not part of their culture. Well, actually, by doing that, you're sort of stifling those voices, right? So let the stories speak for themselves. Your only responsibility here is to look at the individual, start with yourself. What's getting in the way of your ability to listen to your team members? How can you encourage them to listen to one another and create an environment in which it's possible to listen to one another? A couple of hints here. Time and space, very, very important. We really thought about that a lot with this client. Where are we going to do this? How are we going to bring people together? How much time will we have together? That creates a structure, and it creates a kind of a safety net for everyone to know that we're all doing the same thing. So when we do an exercise and people tell stories, we limit that, the time that people have to speak, so that not just one person speaks or tells their story, but everyone gets a chance to do that. And we're all on the same, that we're all aligned on that. And then the really important thing to do that you can do once you hear stories, the reason you don't predetermine anything is because you can then connect these stories to each person's role, right? So Ken's role, he's part of the legal team. He's now clarified that role to everyone else, right? Now we know that he can also contribute to particular areas. What he did after that is he presented a topic that was particularly challenging in Japan at the moment, and how that connected to a topic for the French team, right? So then they were able to see, oh, okay, I see how Ken can now contribute to this, and how we're on the same page as a team, because we're talking about our stories are actually showing us, they're actually clarifying what we do in relation to one another and how they can impact us, right? So as my parting message, before we move on to a Q&A here, for those of you who have time to stay for that, I would love it if you guys started to think about these principles, right? Take some time to actually think about what you've heard here, and of course, I'm sure you've got questions, and so we'll get busy answering those momentarily. But it's really important to invest that time and to be patient with yourselves. But at the same time, don't wait to begin. So even if you're a team of just 3-4 people or less, and you're building a team right now, and you're thinking about that, perhaps it's a great time to do coaching, right? And to sort of think about what your own story is. What's the story of your team? What is the story that you want your team to be aligned on? Create that for yourself, even if you're a one-man or one-woman show at this point. And then go from there, right? If you're a team that already exists, bring people together and start to look at to listen to their stories and see what are the commonalities between people, right? And of course, what we've seen is that clients who follow this process, yes, they report improvements in collaboration and team effectiveness, but you're going to see a ripple effect in the overall culture. Because when people start to work better with one another, it starts to affect the way they speak about their organization and their team. And you're going to see that that affects your actually external messaging too, right? And so the way the outside world perceives you is going to change and be more positive as a result of looking at how you're doing things internally and coming up with those stories that really represent who you are. So you're going to see people are more motivated. They're going to talk about your company in a way that makes a lot more sense, that's more clarified for themselves. They're going to talk about their role in a way that's much more clear. So these are all the kind of benefits that you get from doing this kind of work. And I just want to say a couple of words on how we train people. We do this in 2 ways. We train people in groups, and we also do one-on-one coaching, which I've alluded to. And we have 5 modules that address team-related communication and collaboration challenges. They go from listening modules to then storytelling modules and then applications, right? So the application plan is really important. You'll get that foundation in skills, but it's how you apply those skills that really makes a difference in sort of the overall culture of communication of your team. And then, in ways of delivering this, you can talk to me more about this, but we deliver on site, we deliver online, we do this live, on demand, lots of different ways to do this, especially since we've started using what we call our narrative storytelling practice platform. So these are the things that we look at and how we train people. So where you can get in contact with us, my email, jerome@narrative.com. You can get in contact with us through @narrative on Twitter. You can also go and visit our page @narrative on Facebook and like us on Facebook, please. For those of you who've come to Facebook to look at this webinar, thank you so much. And click that little like button if you like us. I don't think there's a dislike button, so that's good. And now, without further ado, I'm going to take a few questions for the next 10 minutes or so. For those of you who can stay for this, and I'll actually stop sharing my screen at this point so you can see me, and I'll start my video, and here we go. Okay, so I've got the chat going on. So please use the chat button to chat with me at this point. If I can just find it. Yep, here we go. Okay, so any questions that you have, please use the chat button to do that. And just type your message in there. So as you do that, I just want to read out some of these challenges, right? Because they're really kind of interesting here. Someone says, Heather says, we've got 3 departments and each department seems so separate and it seems like admin never does top down the right way. Everyone always hears info like the telephone game, right? Okay, the telephone game. So yeah, you hear something, then you pass it on to somebody else, then it kind of gets muddied and nobody knows what's actually going on, right? So yes, and that's how silos get created. You end up talking only to the people that you feel understand you. And so as a result, you're not really making that effort to understand others. And again, here, what I want to say to that challenge is that remember that it begins with you. So whatever the challenge is, if it's admin, it begins with you. Take that sense of responsibility. Perhaps have a chat with that admin person, right? Ask them what their story is, and again, it's about finding the time and space to do that and finding alignment that this is how we're going to talk to one another. So I see there's a question here. They say that first impressions are critical. How do you transform a team whose members did not have the best first impressions, like team rehab, right? So that's great. First impressions are critical. How do you transform a team whose members did not have the best first impressions? So first of all, what I would like to know is what actually happened in terms of how those first impressions were created. Because remember that we start with listening. And I'll just tell you that there are 5 kind of categories of obstacles to listening that we look at. First one is external, right? So what happens in the external environment. So I'm looking at this space right now. I'm in a space that we've kind of rented out of a common workspace. And there's, it's a little bit hot in here. So I'm feeling that obstacle, right? Now, what you're talking about, first impressions, could be something that's a little more internal, right? Which is the second obstacle that we look at. And so what is going on internally? What's the thought process? What are those preconceptions and stereotypes or those assumptions that might be at play based on what someone looks like or what maybe someone said to someone else, right? So for me, it's about getting people into one room and actually being able to ask them, what are the current obstacles that are in your listening that affect your ability to listen to someone else? And as opposed to saying, well, what's your problem? And tell me the story of your problem, right? But it's more about taking it from the vantage point of listening. We're all here to listen to one another, and we're just trying to create an environment in which we can listen to one another. So if you create a structure in which you actually give time to people to speak, and you tell them, you've got 2 minutes to tell me what are the obstacles to your listening right now, and then move on to the next person, move on to the next person. Don't interrupt each other. Have a timekeeper in the room, and then you'll see what is actually going on with people, right? So if you see what's actually if you hear what's actually going on with people, then you might be surprised by the reality, right? So those first impressions that happen, well, maybe there were just first impressions and maybe things have evolved, right? And maybe you'll get a sense of where they originated. But it's about giving people a voice and making sure that everybody gets heard. Because that's a lot of times where the resentments come from, is that people don't feel heard. They feel like no one's listening to them. They feel like they haven't been listened to. Whether it's a personal thing or a professional thing doesn't really matter. We're not here to create a therapy session. What we're here to do is actually create better listening among us so that we can work better with one another. So really look at that. Really start with listening and really ask people, what is getting in the way of your listening? And start with yourself. There's no better way to start than with yourself so that you can model for others, right? Model for others what is in your listening of others and what's getting in the way of your listening, right? Another question here, do you include the COO at first when you know most issues stem from them? Very good point here. And what I want to say about that is that you do want to notice, if you do notice that something is stemming from one particular individual, probably best to start with the individual and give them a sense of this methodology, right, that we're talking about. So what is getting in the way of that COO's ability to listen to everyone else, right? And what is getting in the way of their ability to tell what their story is of a particular event that happened, right? So I think it's about giving principles and guidelines to someone and making them feel like they're included as opposed to excluded. You're the problem here, so I'm actually going to work with this group over here first, and we're not going to include you in there. No, start with them. Start with them if that's what you've identified, right? And then bring the group together, right? Maybe we've actually done this in an environment where we worked with an entire leadership team of 10 people, a fairly big organization here in the US. And we first worked with their leadership team. And we had some sessions, which we call ethnographic sessions, so that we can find out what's the background here and what's the culture that's going on here. And we had some sessions, individual sessions with the CEO, with the COO, with the CFO, the CMO. and all these sort of C-suite level executives before we actually determined how we could bring them all together, right? So I think it is important to have those kind of individual sessions first and then go to the collective, right? Any other questions here? I think we should probably wrap up soon, so I'm going to leave it at that. There is a recording that's going to be sent to you. You'll also get a PDF document because you registered, which outlines how we train people, how our methodology works, and how it can work for you. We're very interested in learning how you will benefit from working with us. So please let us know what your challenges are. I've seen a few now, but please contact me directly. Contact us on Facebook, on Twitter, etc. And I'm going to tell Gail that I will get back to you about your question. You can all see that question. We are running out of time, and I don't want to keep people for too much longer. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating today, and we hope to hear from you soon. All right, bye.